The winds of the Sahel once carried only dust and despair. For decades, Burkina Faso fought against desertification, hunger, and the crushing weight of climate change. Villages were abandoned as the land cracked, rivers dried, and grasslands turned to sand. But in 2025, something extraordinary happened. President Ibrahim Traoré unveiled a plan so bold that the world could hardly believe it: drop 100 tons of corn seeds from helicopters across the barren savannas. To some, it looked reckless. To others, pure madness. But to Traoré, it was a strike of destiny. Why corn? Why from helicopters? Because maize is more than just food, it is survival. It feeds families, it feeds livestock, and it fuels industry. By scattering seeds from the skies, Traoré wasn't just planting crops, he was planting hope. In just 1 week, military and civilian helicopters swept across the land, raining seeds like golden drops of life. Villagers gathered to watch the skies open with abundance. Children chased the falling kernels, farmers clapped their hands in disbelief, and communities celebrated it as the week the earth was blessed. Critics mocked the plan. Western economists called it wasteful, environmental groups warned of chaos, and even some African leaders doubted its future. But Traoré stood firm. In his signature red beret, he declared, "They always call it madness until it succeeds." And then, the rains came. From the cracked soil, green shoots pushed their way to the sun. From satellites above, streaks of green spread like veins of life across the desert. Antelopes returned to graze, birds built nests, and families harvested their first ears of corn, roasting them in joy. What started as an agricultural experiment became a cultural revolution. Songs, dances, and murals honored the miracle of corn falling from the sky. More than food grew here, sovereignty grew. Pride grew. Belief grew. For years, Burkina Faso had waited for aid planes to deliver survival. Now, its leader turned those same skies into a source of independence. What began as a gamble became a movement, proving to the world that food is the first seed of freedom. But this time, it wasn't foreign aid falling from the sky. It was something far more powerful: seeds of self-reliance. Every kernel represented a rejection of dependency and a bold statement that Africa could innovate on its own terms. The effects were immediate. Farmers began noticing how scattered planting created unexpected opportunities. Villages organized to guard these new fields, setting up watch groups to protect them from overgrazing. Women, who had carried the heaviest burden of feeding families during lean seasons, suddenly found themselves with surplus corn. They dried it, ground it, and sold it in the markets. Survival was no longer the only option. Commerce was born. Cooperatives quickly formed, transforming corn into flour, porridge, and even snacks for local and regional trade. On the global stage, the so-called corn drop rattled assumptions. International media couldn't ignore it. Some mocked, some admired, but all reported it. Aid agencies grumbled that it disrupted their food distribution networks, but ordinary Africans saw something else: a leader who dared to try the impossible. At the African Union, President Traoré declared with fire in his voice, "We are not waiting for charity. We are not waiting for permission. We are planting freedom one kernel at a time." The delegates erupted in a standing ovation. For the first time in years, little landlocked Burkina Faso wasn't following the agenda, it was setting it. The seeds weren't just agricultural. They were political. By reclaiming the story of hunger and turning it into one of ingenuity, Burkina Faso shifted its image from victim to visionary. Western powers began to take notice. Corporations saw new opportunities in agro-processing, while economists scrambled to understand how this bold move might reshape grain markets. But the greatest transformation was inside Burkina Faso itself. Villagers who once waited for aid trucks now looked to their own skies. Children who once dreamed of fleeing abroad now dreamed of becoming agronomists, farmers, and even pilots. Farmers who once feared the desert began to speak of fields of gold returning to the Sahel. Yes, it was a gamble. It required fuel, logistics, and courage. But it achieved something no aid package ever could: it restored faith in themselves. As one elderly farmer said on the radio, "Our president gave us rain made of seeds. Even if half fail, the other half will feed our children. That is better than waiting for handouts that may never come." Thus, the first chapter of Burkina Faso's corn revolution was written not on paper, but in soil and sky. What began as a gamble revealed itself as genius. And as the barren lands turned green, one thing was undeniable: Ibrahim Traoré had once again turned doubt into destiny. And this time, the whole world was watching. By the third year, the experiment was no longer just a spectacle of helicopters raining seeds, it was becoming a foundation for resilience, transforming economies, empowering communities, and reshaping Burkina Faso's place in the world. Food security improved first. Villages once haunted by hunger now stood tall with fields of maize. Families who survived on thin millet porridge now enjoyed roasted corn, fresh cornmeal, and even animal feed from the husks. Childhood malnutrition dropped sharply, according to the Ministry of Health. Markets in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso overflowed with Burkinabe-grown corn, replacing foreign imports. Corn was no longer just food, it was a new symbol of independence. But Traoré's brilliance was not only in feeding people. It was in building economic opportunity. Women's cooperatives, long overlooked in agriculture, became the heartbeat of the new economy. They bought small milling machines, turned corn into flour, and branded it proudly as "Made in Faso." Shops carried local cornmeal, and families began choosing it over imports. Profits funded schools, wells, and microloans, spreading empowerment through every corner of society. Young people, who once only dreamed of leaving, began to see a future at home. Some launched small businesses producing corn oil, snacks, and animal feed. Others started logistics ventures, transporting corn from rural farms to cities. From farmers to entrepreneurs, a new class was rising. And Traoré made sure the revolution was sustainable. Knowing monoculture could be dangerous, he promoted intercropping, mixing corn with beans, peanuts, and livestock systems. Corn stalks fed cattle, husks enriched compost, and soils grew healthier. Burkina Faso avoided the trap of dependence on a single crop, instead building a circular farming system that strengthened resilience. The cultural shift was just as powerful. Annual corn festivals were born, celebrating harvests with music, dance, and competitions for the best recipes. What once symbolized hunger now symbolized hope, community, and pride. Burkina Faso was no longer just fighting hunger. It was leading a revolution of self-belief. Corn porridge soon became a staple in school meals, making sure children were fed and families less burdened. Across the country, artists painted murals of helicopters scattering seeds, depicting the moment as the beginning of a golden rain. What started as an agricultural project was now a national myth, a story parents told their children about the day Burkina Faso reclaimed its dignity. Internationally, the corn revolution transformed the nation's position. No longer begging for food imports, Burkinabe ministers walked into trade talks with confidence and leverage. For the first time, Burkina Faso even began exporting corn-based animal feed to its neighbors struggling with drought. The African Union hailed the initiative as a model of food sovereignty, and delegations from across the continent traveled to study how it worked. What once drew mockery now commanded respect. Of course, challenges remained. Some areas saw weak harvests when rains were scarce, and pests sometimes threatened the fields. Critics warned about soil exhaustion. But instead of collapsing under the pressure, Traoré's government responded with foresight, investing in irrigation, agricultural research, and community grain storage. Unlike past experiments driven by foreign aid, this was a project owned by the people. Every problem solved locally strengthened the sense of pride and unity. Perhaps the most powerful change was psychological. People who once waited for aid trucks now proudly spoke of their own harvests. Farmers who once feared the desert's advance now saw green rows replacing sand. Children no longer whispered about escaping to Europe, instead, they dreamed of becoming agronomists, traders, even pilots for the next great seed drop. President Traoré himself framed it not only as agriculture but as a doctrine of sovereignty. At a rally he declared, "We no longer pray for food drops from foreign plains. We bring down our own future from our own skies." His words echoed across Africa, inspiring debates about how other nations could adapt the model with their own native crops. What began with corn had become a blueprint for self-determination. Within just a few years, the gamble of scattering corn from helicopters had yielded not only food but hope. Burkina Faso was no longer only feeding itself, it was feeding its neighbors. What had once seemed like scattered sprouts in the desert had grown into a structured agricultural system that generated both revenue and influence. The numbers told the story. Annual production surged to nearly 8 million tons of maize, thanks to irrigation, soil renewal, and cooperative farming. Half of this fed the nation, while the rest became surplus for trade. For the first time in history, Burkinabe trucks crossed borders into Mali, Niger, and Ivory Coast, not as aid convoys, but as paid exports. The psychological shift was profound. Corn, once seen as desperation, had become the backbone of a new economy. Biofuel plants powered villages with electricity. Corn oil factories supplied kitchens at home and abroad. Ethanol exports strengthened the nation's trade balance. What had begun as a desperate gamble was now the cornerstone of a diversified economy. Globally, Burkina Faso's success shook assumptions about Africa.